Welcome, Netrunner fans, to part 2 of my Data and Destiny review. In this half, we're going to look at all of the runner cards in the box. And to start out with, we need to talk a little bit about these new mini factions. In the box, we're going to see 3 new IDs, and each one of them is going to have a small group of cards that are considered in faction only for the corresponding ID. In other words, for every other ID except the one that the cards are associated with, they're basically going to be neutral cards that cost some amount of influence. The first of these that we're going to look at is called Apex, Invasive Predator. It's a 45-25, it has 0 link, it's a digital type. You cannot install non-virtual resources. When your turn begins, you may install 1 card from your grip face down. The first thing that we need to consider is how this face down thing works. Basically, face down cards are just blank cards that don't do anything. And the reason that might be useful is that we're going to have other card effects that require us to trash installed cards. So basically every turn we're going to get to install one of these for free. It's not going to cost us a click. Now this non-virtual resources thing, this is really critical. There are a ton of really good resources that are non-virtual, especially things like Aesop's Pawn Shop, which would otherwise be really good with this ID power. We're not going to be able to play that. Same thing with Same Old Thing, Daily Casts, Katie Jones. The list goes on and on. There's so many good economy resources that we're not going to be able to play. We are going to get some extra influence to offset this a bit, and that's going to be true with all of the IDs that we see in the box. They're going to get 25 influence. This guy is probably the weirdest of the 3 IDs in this box, and I think we need to look at the rest of the cards in his pool before we make any sort of judgment about him. The next card is an event called Apocalypse. It's 3 to play, and it's 3 influence. Play only if you've made a successful run on HQ, R&D, and Archives this turn. Trash all installed Corp cards. Turn all installed runner cards face down. Who doesn't love this thing? This card is sweet. This is the closest thing we've seen to a sort of board-wiping, Wrath of God type of effect in Netrunner, and this is an extremely challenging event to pull off. If you consider, like with Notoriety and Quest Completed, we only get 4 clicks, so we're going to have to spend the first 3 of them making these 3 runs, and then we're going to have to play this as our 4th click. We're also going to have to turn all of our installed cards face down, so if we have a sort of permanent rig like most runners have, that's going to basically destroy our side of the board as well. That said, destroying all of the Corp's ice, all the cards that they've set up and defended with the entire game, is certainly a huge payoff. The next card is also an event. This is called Prey, like the opposite of Predator, and it's 0 to play, 2 influence. It's a run type. Make a run. Once during this run, when you pass a piece of ice, you may trash a number of your installed cards equal to the strength of that ice. If you do, trash that ice. A quick clarification before we go into too much detail with this. As far as I'm aware, you can't use this against unresed ice. And the reason for that is that unresed ice don't have strength. So in order for this to be able to choose a piece of ice, you're going to have to choose something that has strength. And all face down cards, including unresed ice, have no game text. So you're not going to be able to pick an unresed piece of ice with this card. That said, I really like this. I think that this is going to be extraordinarily difficult to use outside of Apex, because I think just most decks aren't going to want to just trash their whole board to kill just like a single piece of ice. With Apex, you're going to have plenty of fodder to feed this thing, and it seems to me like one of the key aspects of playing with Apex is going to be how you utilize all of these face down fodder cards that you have. This seems like one of the weaker effects that are associated with these fodder cards, and I think that this card's role in the whole suite is going to make more sense once we see the Icebreaker. Next up is the console for Apex. This is called Heartbeat. It's 2 to play, it's 3 influence, it's unique hardware console, it's +1 MU, it has trash an installed card, prevent 1 damage, and then it's limit 1 per player as they are. The first thing to say about this is, I think this is only the second card in the whole game that prevents damage of any type, rather than specifying, net, meat, or brain. And the only other one is an extraordinarily bad criminal event. This to me seems like it's going to be a must-play within the Apex deck. It's going to be really sweet to have this as a solution to damage-oriented effects. It's very reactionary. You don't have to, you just kind of play this and then you can deal with the damage as it comes in. You just need to have cards installed, and you're going to be putting one of those in play every turn at minimum. This is also pretty scary against all of the flatline-oriented decks. It really messes up their ability to hit you with multiple Scorched Earths, or like a Jinteki deck, I think it would have a lot of trouble with this as well. To me, this seems like you're going to play it as your console. If you're playing Apex, it's going to be no influence for you. It's going to give you that MU, and it's going to be a nice effect against the flatline decks. Now we come to probably the most important card in the Apex card pool. This is called Endless Hunger. It's a new program icebreaker. It's 0 to play, and it's 4 MU. It's 2 influence. It's 11 strength. Trash an installed card, break and end the run subroutine. Well, this is definitely way different than basically every other icebreaker we've seen. Lots of interesting things going on here. First of all, we need to talk about what this can break and just how this works. The important thing to note is that this only breaks subroutines that say verbatim, end the run. So in other words, if it says end the run and do something else, or trace them and then the run ends, or something like that, this doesn't work against it. So this is only going to work against the generic end the run subroutines. For that reason, we're probably going to have to supplement this icebreaker with something else, the most obvious of which is E3 feedback implants. The big thing about E3 is not only are we going to be able to break multiple subroutines without having to trash a million cards, but as long as the ice has a subroutine that says in the run, we can break that one with Endless Hunger, and then just pay credits with the E3 to break all of the other subroutines, which may or may not actually say end the run. This is way different than a lot of other icebreakers we've seen. This really flips the whole idea of icebreaker on the head. We're not going to be paying a bunch of credits to use this. It has 11 strength, so we're not going to be, spending to boost our strength and things like that. This is such a cool and innovative icebreaker, and I really think that this is the defining element of Apex. You're going to have a good plan of how to make this work in order for you to build a deck around him. The next Apex card is also a program. This is Harbinger. It's 0 to play, it's 0 MU, 1 influence. When Harbinger is trashed, install it face down instead of adding it to your heap. So this is like super fodder. We're going to install it and trash it to like Endless Hunger or something, and then it's going to come back in face down and we're going to get to trash it again. And at that point, once we trash it, it'll go to the heap. Keep in mind that face down cards have no text, so this effect is only going to work when you've installed it normally, not when you've installed it with Apex or it's installed itself after you trashed it. That said, that's still pretty good. Getting this double use out of a single card is definitely going to be nice for any of these trash a card effects. It seems to me like you're definitely going to be playing like 2 or 3 of these mandatory in your Apex deck just to make everything go a little farther. but I'm not sure it's really got a lot of uses outside of that context. I mean, maybe you could like recycle this with Aesop's pawn shop or something. I think probably not. The next Apex card is a resource, and it is virtual. This one's called Hunting Grounds. It's 2 to install, it's 1 influence. It's a location virtual. Once per turn, prevent a when encountered ability on a piece of ice, and then it has trash. Install the top 3 cards of your stack face down. I've talked in the past about how difficult it is to deal with these when encountered abilities, just because you can't use icebreakers to deal with them. This to me seems like it could maybe see some play outside of the Apex deck, just because the when encountered ice are pretty prevalent and they're really strong. This would be really, really good against something like Data Raven. Now the installing face down thing, that's going to be largely useless outside of Apex, unless you play something like Aesop's in your deck or whatnot. But I think realistically, this is just going to be a nice supplement to Endless Hunger as a way for you to have a more well-rounded rig. The last Apex card is the one that I think has the most potential outside of the faction. This is called Wasteland. It's a new resource. It costs 2 to play. It's 2 influence. It's a location and it's virtual. The first time each turn you trash one of your installed cards, gain a credit. Earlier I talked about how Apex loses a lot of strong economic options because he can't play the non-virtual resources. So it seems to me like this is just an obvious and mandatory 3 of in your Apex deck. You're going to get a lot of value out of this as you trash your cards, especially since this would stack. So you could potentially get 3 credits when you trash the first card each turn. That seems pretty decent. Now, the big thing for me that's kind of awkward about this is that this is going to give you credits probably after you're already set up. Like, for example, you're going to have to install Wasteland, which is 2 credits. And if you want to get any real economy going, you're probably going to need multiples of these. So this is certainly not a be-all, end-all of your economy. You're still going to need stuff to get you enough credits to set up this type of rig. I could see this being pretty good in a non-Apex deck that's playing either Aesop's Pawn Shop or the Chop bot. And maybe you could just play the Chop bot in the Apex deck. But this seems like it's stacking with Aesop's or stacking with Chopbot is going to be a lot stronger than just using Wasteland. So I could maybe see this seeing a little bit of play outside of Apex, but I really think this is going to be instrumental to the economy of Apex. The next of these mini factions starts with the ID Adam. He's a compulsive hacker. He's 4525, he's Zero Link, and he's a Bioroid type. You start the game with 3 different directive cards installed, and these are not considered part of your deck. Obviously, this ID doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless we look at the directive cards, so I'm actually going to take this a little out of order, and we're going to look at those first, and then we'll come back and do the rest of it and talk about Adam a little bit. We have 3 directives. They're each unique, and they're all resources. We're going to look first at Always Be Running. This is 0 to install, it's 3 influence, it's a directive virtual. Your first click each turn must be spent to make a run or play a run event. Then it has once per turn, you can spend 2 clicks to break a subroutine on a piece of ice currently being encountered. So all of these directives are going to have a sort of downside, but then some sort of powerful upside as well. This 2 clicks to break a subroutine thing is definitely strongest against some of the really big high-end ice that only have 1 subroutine. So like Toll Booth or Susanoo, that would be really strong against. There's also a bunch of ice where they only have 1 subroutine that actually stops you. So if you're able to let the other ones fire, being able to break that one end the run subroutine or one really devastating subroutine would certainly help with that. This also gets a lot more powerful if you play something like E3. You could use this to break one subroutine and then E3 to break the rest. But either way, we're definitely going to need real icebreakers. This isn't going to just get us through every piece of ice. We can only use it against one ice. It's very click intensive. So it seems like to me that we're still pretty clearly going to have to play like a regular rig in addition to this. I don't see the downside, the having to run first click. I don't see that as being a huge downside. I think the other two probably have a more extreme downside. There are a lot of good run events, and making runs early in the turn is usually when we want to make the runs anyway. So while it is a little cramping on your flexibility, it's certainly not a huge disadvantage. The next directive is called Neutralize All Threats. It's unique as well. It's 0 to play, 3 influence. It's a resource directive virtual. The first time each turn you access a card with a trash cost, you must trash it by paying its trash cost if able. Whenever you access cards from HQ, access one additional card. So this one is definitely the blessing and curse. Multi-accessing on HQ, especially early in the game, that's pretty sweet. And it's really expensive to normally be able to do that. A lot of times we're just playing like one legwork in our deck. So our opportunities to access more than one card on HQ, especially early and mid game, is usually pretty limited with most decks. This guy, this Atom guy, is going to just have a multi-access effect from the get-go. That's huge. But at the same time, it's going to be really sketchy to use that multi-access opportunity in the early game. What if we just run into like a pad campaign and we have to trash it out of HQ? Yeah, that's good, to get rid of their drip economy, but it could also bankrupt us, and we don't have any control over that. Of all of the directives, I think this is the one that probably has the most potential outside of Atom. That 0 install cost is going to be really hot, and it's going to be a lot cheaper than something like HQ Interface. And it's a little more expensive on the influence cost, but I think that could be worth it depending on, the deck and things like that. The last of these directives is called Safety First. It's also unique, it's also 0 to install, and it's also 3 influence. It's a resource directive virtual. Your maximum hand size is reduced by 2. When your turn ends, draw a card if you do not have cards in your grip equal to or greater than your maximum hand size. So it's worth pointing out that the timing of this on our discard phase is going to be, we discard down to our maximum hand size, we have a res/paid ability window, and then our turn ends. So this ability is going to trigger after we've discarded down to our maximum hand size. And because we only get to draw the card if we're not at or above our maximum hand size, we're probably going to want to play effects that increase our hand size. Now that's obviously going to struggle against the downside of this, where our hand size is reduced by 2. So I'm anticipating that we're probably going to want to play some things in our deck to increase our hand size, and we're going to see a card later on that's going to help us with that. Now that we've seen the directives in the ID, let's look at some of the other cards that we have in Faction. And the first one is an event called Independent Thinking. It's 1 to play and 1 influence. Trash up to 5 of your installed cards. Draw a card for each card you trashed, or 2 cards for each card you trashed if you trashed at least 1 directive. So here's a way for 1 credit that we can draw up to 10 cards. That's pretty crazy. This definitely doesn't seem good enough if you're not trashing a directive. That's my first reaction to this. So even though this card might fit something like Apex because you're just going to have so much junk to trash, I don't really think it's going to be worth it to just draw 1 card for that. You might as well just play something like Quality Time or whatnot. This to me seems like trashing a directive is mandatory, and it's really strong. It definitely fits in with the idea of us playing something to increase our hand size. If we get a really big hand size, then we can filter out, one of our directives and a bunch of other junk that we have in play, and we're going to be able to draw a bunch of cards. I don't really see this as being the type of card that you're going to want to play more than like 1 or 2 of in your deck. You're not going to want this early. It requires some amount of setup to get your benefit, and I don't see you just wanting to trash your starting directives, because those are kind of the core advantage of the ID. It seems to me like you're going to want to build up a little bit and then trash the least useful directive along with a bunch of other junk you have in play. Next up we have his console. This is Brain Chip. It's unique, it's 2 to play, it's 3 influence. Hardware console. It has plus X MU, and your maximum hand size is increased by X. X is equal to the number of agenda points you have, and it's limit 1 console per player. This is pretty powerful. Even just early in the game, if you steal 1 2-pointer, this can be 2 MU and 2 hand size for 2 cost. That's really, really strong by most of the consoles that we've seen so far standards, and it's only going to get stronger throughout the course of the game. If you can get up to 3 or 4 points with this is going to be a really, really powerful way to not only increase your hand size, but also give you just a massive amount of MU. I see this pretty much always going to be able to give you 2 in the course of a game. By the time that you actually care about a rig, it's going to probably be able to get up to 2. So I think that this is a really solid console. The 3 influence is probably going to keep it out of most decks that aren't Atom. So this to me seems like another one of the advantages to playing Atom. Next up we have a program. This is Multi-Threader. It's 3 to install, 1 MU, it's 1 influence. It has 2 recurring credits. Use these credits to pay for using programs. This seems like the Atom card that has the most potential outside of his faction, though I can definitely still see playing it in faction. The big thing about this is, in the late game, if you're playing kind of a slower, big rig deck, this is going to give you a way to pay to use your icebreakers and get through their ice without getting totally taxed out. When you get into those situations against like RP or HB or maybe Blue Sun, where they have like 2 or 3 ice deep servers, you're going to need something like this to be able to pay through their ice, especially if you're using like the corroder style pump up the strength, pump to break type icebreakers. This could definitely see some play in like Big Rig Shaper. I think it could be really solid in like Chaos Theory or something like that. Maybe Kate, although the MU could be some issues there. This definitely fits in Atom though as well. The Brain Chips is going to give you enough MU that you can play a rig with this, and this is really just going to power those standard style breakers late game. The next Atom card is kind of strange. This is Dr. Lovegood. He's a 2 to install resource connection. He's 1 influence. When your turn begins, choose one of your installed cards. The text box of that card is blank for the remainder of the turn. So here's a way that you can turn off the directive's negative side, either after you've used the positive side or if you're just not planning on using the positive side that turn. So that's pretty cool. I also immediately thought of the card The Source, where you'd be able to blank it out so that you don't have to pay 3 to steal and it won't get trashed when you steal. But then you could still take advantage of the agenda's advancement requirement increased by 1 because it's only blank until the end of your turn. Another thing to point out with this is that you can always just use it on himself. So like if you don't want to blank out one of your directives or you just for whatever reason don't want to use him this turn, you can blank himself out. This is a really funky tool I expect only to see in Atom, but this is the type of card that could get better over the history of the game as we get more cards that this interacts positively with. The final of these mini factions starts with the ID Sonny LeBeau, Security Specialist. She's a 50/25, she's a natural, and she's 2 Link, and that's all she does. The first and most obvious thing to say about Sonny is this is the first 2 Link runner we've ever had in the game, and that's like her core power. Now we've seen a few cards, especially Underworld Contacts, that are based on 2 Link. We also have the whole array of cloud breakers, and there's kind of two classes of those. We have the earlier ones, which I think are largely horrible outside of Zool, and then we have the newer ones that are kind of the Geist breaking and entering sort of cloud breakers. Now, these are generally not all that good and haven't seen a whole ton of play, and I think that they're probably not going to see a lot of play in Sunny either, mainly because we have a whole new suite of cloud breakers later in this box. So let's look at some of the other Sunny cards and we'll see how we can abuse having 2 Link. The first Sunny card we have is a new piece of hardware called Security Chip. It's 0 to play, it's 1 influence, it's a chip type. It has trash, choose an icebreaker, or any number of cloud icebreakers. Each chosen icebreaker has +1 strength for each link you have for the remainder of this run. Use this ability only during a run. It seems to me like it's pretty obvious you're only going to play this in the Sunny deck, and once we see the icebreakers, it might make a little more sense why. Being able to affect an entire rig of cloud icebreakers makes this way stronger than if it was just targeting one of them and giving them like +1 strength. This is going to be 2 strength bonus to all of your icebreakers if you're playing that full cloud rig, and it's very, very inexpensive at 0 cost. So this to me seems like a Sunny only card that's going to be a nice supplement to this rig we're about to look at. I'd like to point out briefly that this lasts until the end of the run. So even if you pump up an icebreaker that you're not going to use in a given encounter, you might use it later on a different piece of ice during the run. That's pretty sweet. Next up we have Sunny's console. This is Security Nexus. It's 8 to play, it's unique, and it's 3 influence. Hardware console. It's +1 MU and Link. Once per turn, when you encounter a piece of ice, you may force the corp to trace 5. If successful, give the runner a tag and end the run. If unsuccessful, the runner bypasses the currently encountered ice, and it's limit 1 console per player as they are. This is an extremely expensive console that does something that's basically impossible to do otherwise. Bypassing ice, there's only a couple ways to do that in the whole game, and they're both pretty good. The thing about bypassing is not only do you not have to break the ice, but you also don't have to deal with the win encountered effects. And keep in mind that when there's multiple win encountered effects going on, if it's your turn, like when you're making the run, you get to resolve your stuff first. So in other words, this is going to fire before the win encountered effects will fire. Now you're going to have to win this trace. Luckily we have a whole bunch of Link. We're going to have 3 if we're playing this in Sunny. That's going to really help us win traces. So that's pretty cool as well. This to me seems like a pretty amazing thing if you can actually get it going, but that 8 cost, that's going to mean that Sunny is probably going to be a more big rig, late game oriented deck. You're going to have enough credits to be able to afford to spend 8 of them on a console. And then even then, you're not going to get like immediate return until you start running and you have your full icebreaker rig and everything. So this is a really sweet console, but it's extremely expensive to use. Now we come to the first of the Sunny icebreakers. This is GS Striker M1. It's 4 to install, it's 1 MU, 2 influence, and it has 1 strength. It's an icebreaker decoder cloud. If you have at least 2 Link, the memory cost of it is 0 even if it's not installed. That's the cloud part. Then it has 2 credits, break any number of code gate subroutines, and then it has 2 credits plus 3 strength. This is pretty solid. It's not the best of the 3, although all 3 of these are going to look pretty similar. The big thing I'm thinking about this, and just cloud in general, is with your Sunny deck, you're not going to have to worry about MU at all. You're going to install this, it's going to be 0 MU, so you're going to have the rest of your MU to go to other things. And one of the first things that I thought of was data folding. which isn't actually a way to capitalize on having on actually using the MU. It just gives you credits if you aren't using the MU. So that's pretty cool, especially since we already have the Underworld Contact I was mentioning earlier. So I'm already imagining this Sonny deck as having a lot of drip economy, having an icebreaker like this one, and having this sort of late game, really big rig sort of strategy, especially with the console we just looked at as well. The next icebreaker is GS Shrike M2. This is 5 to install, 1 MU, it's 2 influence, and it starts with 1 strength. It's an icebreaker killer cloud. It has the cloud ability, which is if you have at least 2 link, its memory cost is 0. 2 credits, break any number of sentry subroutines. 2 credits plus 3 strength. Wow, this thing is way better than the other one. Not only do sentries tend to have lots of subroutines, so the breaking any number of subroutines is really huge, but this also has a pretty good method to matching strength with some of the really monster huge sentries, like Susanoo. And at 2 influence, I could definitely see playing this outside of Sonny. This is pretty clearly the best of her icebreaker setup, and I actually anticipate this seeing a fair amount of play, maybe in like Shaper Big Rig, or maybe occasionally in Anarch as well. But this is just a really solid sentry breaker that's extremely versatile and solves all of your problems. You don't need to have a huge variety of sentry breakers if you're going to play this one. The last of her breakers is called GS Sherman M3. It's 3 to install, 1 MU, 2 influence, 1 strength. It's an icebreaker fractor cloud. If you have at least 2 link, it costs 0 MU. It's 2 to break any number of barrier subroutines, and it's 2 for plus 3 strength. This is definitely not blowing my mind. The 2 for plus 3 strength, that could be kind of nice against the really high-end strength, but the problem I'm having with this is it's going to be really expensive against the lower-end barriers, because almost all of those have slightly more than 1 strength, so you're going to be committed to pumping strength and breaking. Like, for example, against Eli, you're going to pay 4. That's pretty expensive. That said, this is still an okay icebreaker, especially in Sonny, where it's not going to take any MU, it's cheap to install. I think you're probably still going to use this over something like Corroder, which is going to cost you both influence and it's going to cost MU as well. The next Sonny card is called Global Sec Security Clearance. It's a 2 to install resource virtual. It's also 2 influence. Install only if you have at least 2 link. When your turn begins, you may lose a click. If you do, look at the top card of R&D. We've seen several cards that have this peak at R&D effect. Woman in the red dress is immediately the one that I thought of. And for the most part, those effects have been pretty bad. Or they've been really expensive and hard to use. Now this, you can definitely play in Sonny. You're going to have the 2 link, so that makes it easy to install. You are going to lose a click to do this, but I think the information is almost always going to be worth it. I immediately thought of maybe using Pancakes, aka Adjusted Chronotype, with this. You could use it as a way to not have to lose that click. Maybe that's going to be worth it. To me, it seems like almost always it's going to be worth it to spend the click. You can look at R&D, see if there's an agenda there, see if there's something you want to trash there, and in general, that's going to always be worth the click, I'd say. The last Sonny card is called Jack Sinclair. He's a unique 3 to play resource connection. He's 2 influence. Reduce the cost to install Jack by 1 for each link you have. When your turn begins, you may make a run. You cannot use programs during this run. This seems kind of iffy for me as a Sonny card. On one hand, I see that we can use this with our security nexus, so that we can bypass an ice with the security nexus. We don't necessarily have to worry about the program thing. We also get to reduce the cost to install this for having 2 link. So I guess, yeah, that helps. But for me, the main problem I'm seeing with this is that the rig, the MU-less cloud breakers that we just looked at, those seem like one of the best aspects of playing Sonny to me. To me, I could definitely see this in the Atom deck, because we already have Always Be Running, and we could potentially use that with E3. It'd be a way that we could break the ice without having to use programs. I don't know, this is an interesting card. I really, really like this reducing its cost for each Link thing. I think that's a really good way to incentivize playing Link and using Link effects. But I'm not 100% wild about this exact implementation of it. Getting this extra click basically is pretty sweet. It could maybe power something like Data Sucker or security testing on like a blank server, on a server with no ice. But I don't know, this is a little iffy to me. It seems like it's losing one of the best advantages of Sonny, which is this rig. The final 3 cards in the box are actual neutral cards. And the first one that we have is a new current called Employee Strike. This is 1 to play, it's 1 influence. It's a current, which means it's not trashed until another current is played or an agenda is scored by the corp. The corp's identity text box is blank. Man, this thing is pretty good. I would say this is definitely one of the best runner currents. The big thing about this is that it's going to shut off a lot of really, really good effects that come out of the corp ID. Engineering the Future, that's a credit every turn, it's going to shut it off. Something like PE, that's really powerful. RP, it's going to make it a lot easier to run their remote servers. Blue Sun, that's huge. Harpsichord, that seems like just a game winner there. Harpsichord a lot of times really relies on its own ID power to not get totally blown out on R&D, and if you play this, that's just going to totally negate it altogether. Man, this thing seems really good. It's kind of interesting to note that we have a similar version of this card on the other side of the game in the form of Cerebral Static, and I think that's seen a little bit of play, but I anticipate this one being a lot more popular on the runner side, just because turning off the corp ID is way better than turning off the runner ID in my opinion. The next card is Windfall. This is a 0 cost event, it's 0 influence as well. Shuffle your stack. Trash the top card of your stack, gain X, where X is equal to the install cost of that card. Ugh, this thing's bad. This is the type of card where you're pretty much imagining a bunch of cool plays, like you're going to flip Monolith and gain 18 credits or whatever, but it's going to be so hard to do that, and building a deck around that idea is maybe fun to do, but is certainly not going to be competitive. The main problem with this is that you have to shuffle your stack. So in other words, you're going to have some way where there's not very many cards in your deck. So if you had like Max or something like that, you could mill your whole deck and then put maybe a couple cards back into your deck with something like Trope, and then you could fire off the Windfall. But I don't really see why you would build a deck to do that when you could just play a better economy card and not have to mess around with something like this. So maybe in the future this could make a little bit more sense if we're more commonly depleting the runner's stack, or if for whatever reason we play a ton of high install cost cards, but I really don't see that. Another thing I want to quickly point out as I dismiss this card is that if you hit an event, events don't have install costs, they only have play costs. So in other words, a high cost event is going to be 0 on this. I really wish this was better. For as cool as this is, I really don't anticipate this seeing any play. The last card in Data in Destiny is called Technical Writer. It's a 0 cost resource that's also 0 influence. Whenever you install a piece of hardware or a program, place a credit from the bank on it, and then it has click trash, take all credits from it. I'm not particularly impressed with this either. To me, it seems like this is maybe a card where you could build your whole deck around it, where you're installing tons and tons of programs and hardware, and then you're going to pop it and gain like 8-10 credits. I could also maybe see it working with the Geist style, if you're using all the cloud breakers, since you're going to be installing a lot of cards over time. To me, it seems like you're going to have your whole deck built around the idea that you're installing tons and tons of programs or maybe hardware just to get even any reasonable amount of credits out of this. So I think for the most part, this is going to sit in the box unless you have a really, really specific idea of how to use it. That's going to do it for Data and Destiny. I have to admit that I'm a little conflicted on the runner half of this box. On one hand, I think that there's a lot of new ground being covered, and I think that's just really a big mark of this whole box. They're really pushing some of the edges of the design space and trying out some new ideas, and we see a lot of that on the runner side. All three of these new IDs, but especially Apex and Atom, are just so fundamentally different than anything we've seen before, and a lot of their cards do some really interesting things mechanically. While I think that there are a few playables that are going to see play kind of in the broader metagame, especially Apocalypse and Multi-Threader, that seems pretty decent. I definitely think the GS Shrike M2 is good enough to see play in the broader metagame, maybe a handful of other cards. But overall, I think that one of the strengths and weaknesses of this box is the mini faction idea. It's going to be very self-contained, which means if you like one of those ideas, you don't have to buy a lot of cards, but it also means that a lot of those cards are probably not going to see a lot of play in the broader game. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, be sure to subscribe to my channel and press the button that looks like a thumbs up. And I'll see everybody again for some more Netrunner stuff.